بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم. Our topic today will be about the forearm. To start with, the forearm, anatomically speaking, is composed of two parts. First part, that's the skeleton of the forearm, which refers to the bones that form the framework of the forearm. Bones of the forearm are two bones. One, which is medially situated bone, called ulna. Second one, which is the laterally situated bone, that's called the radius. Ulna is a long bone. It's composed from three parts. Upper part, which is the expanding part, formed mainly of olecranon process and the coronoid tuberosity. Middle part, shaft of the ulna, which is long, mainly composed of a compact bone, and the lower part, which is narrow part of the ulna, or called distal ulna. In the anterior view of the ulna, you will find that the ulna is formed from upper part with expanding and projecting upward process called olecranon process. In front of this process, below, a depression called trochlear notch. And here, trochlear notch represents the upper articular facet of the ulna, which will articulate with the trochlea of the humerus at the elbow joint. Next to this, an elevated and expanding part called coronoid process or coronoid tuberosity of the ulna, which is an important area, gives attachments for the insertion of brachialis muscle. On its lateral surface or lateral border of the coronoid process, a small notch for articulation with the head of radius called radial notch. And here is another articular facet for articulation between the ulna and radius at the proximal radio-ulnar joint. This means that the proximal part of ulna possess two articular areas. The first one between the trochlear notch and trochlea of the humerus at the elbow joint. Second one between the radial notch and the head of radius to form the proximal radio-ulnar joint. Next to the coronoid tuberosity, there is the shaft of the ulna. Elongated part, bordered on transverse section. As you see, it has three borders: an anterior border, posterior border, and a lateral border. It has three surfaces: anterior surface, medial surface, as you see, and posterior surface. The lateral border of the ulna. The lateral border of the ulna, an important anatomical landmark. It gives attachment for an important membrane called interosseous membrane. As you see, this is the lateral border of the ulna, and this is the interosseous membrane, an important membrane which attached between the lateral border of the ulna to the medial border of the radius, fix these two bones together. Another function for interosseous membrane, it is act as an attachment for the muscles of the forearm. Below is the lower part of the ulna, which is a narrow part, has an inferior surface, which is called articular surface, and on its medial part, medial side, a small projection, downward projection, called styloid process of the ulna. An important note here that the lower end of the ulna, it carries a minor role in the articulation at the wrist joint. Another important note, that most of the posterior surface of the ulna is lacking any muscle attachment, so the posterior surface of the ulna is subcutaneous. Also, the styloid process of the ulna, it lies immediately beneath the skin, and it is subcutaneous and easily palpable through the skin. In this figure you can see posterior surface of the ulna, the upper part, olecranon process. Also, the olecranon process is subcutaneous and is easily palpable at the elbow joint. An important muscle gives an its insertion at the tip of the olecranon process is the triceps muscle. You can see that the posterior surface, especially in its distal part, is lacking of any muscle attachment, and it is palpable through the skin as well as the styloid process. Second bone that forms the skeleton of the forearm is the radius. It is the laterally situated bone. In controversy to ulna, it is narrow in its upper part and expanded in its lower part. It is a long bone, has an upper part formed of head and neck, and lower expanding part, which is the styloid area or the distal part of the radius. In the proximal part, in the upper part, head of radius, which is circular in shape, possess an upper flattened articular part for articulation with the capitellum at the elbow joint, and a rounded circumference which is attached or articulated with the annular ligament, which will give an articulation with the ulna at the proximal radio-ulnar joint. Next to the head, the constricting part of the radius, which is the neck of the radius. Neck of radius is an important landmark next to the neck. There is an expanding or bony process called radial tuberosity. It is an important landmark, gives an attachment for insertion of the tendon of the biceps muscle. So it may be called as another name biceptal tuberosity of the radius. Next to the tuberosity, there is the shaft of the radius, elongated part on transverse section. It has three surfaces: anterior surface, posterior surface, and lateral surface. It has three borders: anterior border, posterior border, a medial border, or the interosseous border, which will give attachment for the interosseous membrane, which will fix the radius to the ulna and give it strong fixation point. Next to the shaft of radius is the lower part of the radius, which is expanding part. Its inferior surface is an articular surface it will articulate with the proximal row of the carpal bone to form a wrist joint. An important note that the wrist joint is mainly formed by articulation between the distal end of the radius and proximal row of the carpal bone. Another facet is present on its medial surface, which is called ulnar notch, and this notch is actually an articular facet between the radius and the ulna to form the distal radio-ulnar joint. The lower end of the radius on its lateral border, also it has a downward projection called styloid process of the radius. Also, as in the ulna, styloid process of the radius is subcutaneous. It is easily palpable through the skin. On the lower part of the posterior surface of the radius, a small bony tubercle called dorsal tubercle of the radius, and this tubercle also, it is subcutaneous, can be palpated beneath the skin. Both radius and ulna, they will give an attachment for the groups of the muscles of the forearm. In its anterior surface, they will give attachment for the flexor group of the muscles of the forearm, like the flexor digitorum profundus muscle, flexor digitorum superficialis muscle, flexor pollicis longus, which will represent the superficial group of the flexor muscles of the forearm. Also, they will give attachment for the groups of muscles of the deep layer of the anterior muscle of the forearm, like the pronator quadratus in the anterior surface lower border of both ulna and radius. In its proximal part, you can see insert and distally brachioradialis muscles. The posterior surface of the radius and ulna, they give the attachment for the another group of muscles, which called the extensor group of muscles of the forearms. They attach at different sites on the radius and ulna, commonly the supinator muscles, abductor pollicis longus muscle, extensor pollicis longus muscle, extensor digitorum profundus muscle, Thank you.